Hi, welcome back. This is Rachel, and we are going to be discussing historical fiction and examining World War II historical fiction in particular. And it's going to be over the next two book talks. And part of the reason for that is I want to look at historical fiction through different lenses. And this week, we're going to examine historical fiction World War II through a younger lens. And by that, I'm going to be looking at books that would be perfectly acceptable for those who are in middle school, and one book even for upper elementary. But I always hesitate to put a limit, like a reading limit on things, because I still enjoy picture books. I also find them to be very fascinating um, for any level. And so I do think young adults would enjoy them as well. But what I really want to talk about is that historical fiction provides us an opportunity to look at history through a different lens. And oftentimes, at least for me, I find a particular period of history to be interesting and I want to dive into it. And World War II tends to be a period of history that I have a lot of students ask me to find fiction on. Um, the Holocaust, internment camps here in the United States, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, um, the race to build the bomb, all of these things, and all of these things are, for whatever reason, alive still in our imaginations. And I think because for some of us, at least in my age group, which is 44 as this moment, I have a connection with stories of my grandparents. They remember these events. For some of us, I also have had the opportunity to listen to Holocaust survivors speak. And I think that it's difficult for many of us to imagine human beings being capable of something that tragic and that huge, not just in one area of the world, but everywhere. And there is always that tagline of never forget. And I shouldn't call it a tagline, it's something we need to remember. And yet we see it repeated throughout history. And so, for people who love history, for people who recognize that history is something that we should learn from, and yet we kind of keep forgetting to learn from it, historical fiction is a wonderful way of viewing it. So, the books that I've selected deliberately provide different lenses to view history. And as all of the books I'm going to show you just take place in Europe. Now, keep in mind, World War II. This took place across a massive scale. So many experiences, and I have read a lot of historical fiction and nonfiction that deals with it. And in fact, later this year, I'm going to be reading the Young Adult Nonfiction Award winners for 2020, and three of the books that were honored all have to do with World War II. And there is a lot to digest and to look at. So keep that in mind that we're going to be looking, and I'm going to be talking about the perspective. And sometimes a certain perspective will hook you, and you really want to know more. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the books, because those are the most important things. Some are older ones, and next week I'm going to be talking about a brand new one that came out this year. But all of them are really brilliant in their own ways. So here we go. The first book I want to talk about is Adam and Thomas, and it's by Aharon Appelfeld. And you see, if I can point it out, this lovely sticker here, which marks it as a Batchelder Honor Book. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Batchelder Award, it is bestowed by the American Library Association. I look for these awards, and I just want to tell you why. It is bestowed upon a book that the year before was published in another country, in another language, and then the next year is translated into English and published in the United States. So what you're getting is a slice from another country, a real different point of view. And they're not always historical fiction books. They can be contemporary. But it's a really great way to expand what you know of the world outside of just your community. So I love the Batchelder award and honor books. So Adam and Thomas by Aharon Appelfeld is an honor book, and Mr. Appelfeld passed away in 2018. Very well published, well recognized scholar and a Holocaust survivor. His story is also, he has written an adult memoir about how he survived. But his story, in some ways, you'll see nuggets of it in this book, which is appropriate for upper elementary, and I liked it. Keep in mind when you read Bachelor Awards, they're not going to be written like you would normally expect a book that's written by an American author. And also, it's a translation. This was originally published in Hebrew. Mr. Appelfeld lived in Israel. When he was 8 years old, and I'm talking about Mr. Appelfeld, when he was 8 years old, he escaped, and I want to make sure I get the right concentration camp. He escaped from Transnistria, okay, which is not as well known as some of the others, but he was 8 years old. 8 years old, people, and he escaped. And he ended up surviving by living in the woods for 3 years until he was picked up. This is one of the closest camps to where the Red Army was, okay, to where Soviet was. And they took him on as like a cook and so forth. And then he traveled with them. But for 3 years, he survived, 8 years old. That's his real life, okay? This man taught at a university. Like I said, he was a very well-known scholar, and he published many books. This, as far as I know, is his only, this was his first, as far as I know, only book that he ever published for youth. And it's just brilliant. I have to say that first of all. And when you read it as an adult, you think it's kind of simple. But I believe what Aharon Appelfeld is doing is he is introducing to young children that feeling of a young child not understanding what's going on. So what happens? Adam and Thomas are both 9-year-old boys who are left in the woods to fend for themselves. Sound familiar to Mr. Appelfeld's story? A bit. They were in a ghetto, okay, and they're separately dispatched by their mothers, okay, on the same day. And you draw the conclusion that something has happened in the ghetto where the Nazis are rounding up people, okay? They're rounding up people, and you can guess where they're going, a concentration camp. So the mothers have found ways, secret ways, to get out of the ghettos, and they're trying to save their family. So Adam is very wood savvy. He's very outdoor savvy. And so he gets dropped off. And then she tells him, I need to go back for your grandparents. I have to go back to get them out and bring them here. I will be back. I will be back. But if I'm not back by this time at night, go to this person that lives nearby, okay? Meaning a non-Jewish person, okay? And you gather, if you're a very good, close reader, that this person has probably been given money to take him in and pretend that this is their child, okay? Now, Thomas is basically told the same thing, but he's dropped off a little bit later at a different part of the woods. Adam is fine. Adam's kind of like, I like the woods, I'm good. Well, their mothers never come back, and they end up finding each other. Now, Thomas is filled with doubts. He is worried about everything. He doesn't know how. He's not used to the woods. His family never came out there. What am I doing? And Adam and Thomas end up drawing strength from each other. They didn't really know each other well in school, even though they attended the same school. They were in the same ghetto. But he's worried, okay? And you see how they end up drawing strength from each other. And I'm not going to continue more about what happens in their story. But they're near where the ghetto is. And you have people who are trying to escape. And there's lots of hazards and things that are happening. And the boys know, in one part of their mind, they know that there's danger. They know that there is something going on. They know that being Jewish means there is a target on their back. But they also don't fully comprehend what all of that means. But Adam continually has faith. My mother is going to come for me. She is going to come for me because she always keeps her promises. Thomas is a little bit more grown. and a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more understanding of what is happening. But they learn to lean on each other. This is a really brilliant book, and it's beautifully illustrated. I just need to show you some of the, I hate bending my books, but I'm going to do it to show you, okay? This is beautifully illustrated. Almost every other page is illustrated with something that is going on in the book. And I mean, look at this. Look at this. I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And there is this sense of balance because they are in nature. As all of this destruction is going on around them, there is this beauty of nature that continues to grow. But how do they feed? How do they eat? Who helps them? All of these are things that are answered in this book. It's absolutely brilliant. The next book I want to talk about, so that's one lens, the lens of very much being a child and not fully understanding what's happening or what will come. And Adam also has extreme faith in God. Thomas, I'd hate to say doubting Thomas, but I also feel like Aharon Appelfeld as a scholar deliberately provided that character with that name. So there's a really interesting contrast there. So the next book I want to talk about is Yellow Star. Okay, and Yellow Star is written by Jennifer Roy, who is a former teacher, and many of people in her family are Holocaust survivors. And this is based on one of them, her aunt Sylvia, who used to be named Silva and changed it to Sylvia. And it's written in free verse. I just have to gather myself because so many of these books have such meaning and depth. So it's hard to rush through them a little bit. So if you don't recall or you didn't watch the book talk where I talked about free verse are books that are written in poetry instead of prose. Don't let it scare you because it reads just like dialogue, okay, like somebody talking to you. And this little book packs such a punch. And it includes a timeline of events at the end, an author's note in the beginning and at the end describing why she, first of all, her struggle and how to tell her aunt's story, and also how she didn't know about it for years, because people who go through traumatic events like this, it's not like you sit around and talk about it. And she also shares about people who have passed away in her family from the things that have happened, and that as an American Jew, you do know the idea of never forget, but do you really talk about this? Even though you know never forget. And she felt that she needed to honor that, which is why she pursued the story. So let me tell you about Silva. Silva, at the age of 4.5 in 1939, in Łódź, Poland, is rounded up by the Nazis. They come and invade. And if you don't know anything about history, you know Poland just, I'm not gonna diss any other countries because, you know, Germany just, you know, took a whack at all of them. Germany, I know, this is history. But Poland just really got decimated. And so she's living in Łódź with her family, and they come in, and a ghetto is set up. And she lived there. She entered it at 4.5, and at 10 years old, she emerged when the war ended. So this is a perspective of a very young child. And by the way, I believe they say 12. Let me see. There were 800 survivors, and of those survived, only 12 were children, and she was one of the 12. And seeing that experience again through a child's eyes, okay, what is that like? How much do you understand? And really, when you're living in that kind of environment, there's not much that your family can hide. I always like to express to adults too, like when they think that they're being able to hide things from their kids, I'm like, come on, you remember when you were a kid. There are certain things you can't hide. And I think in an environment like this, there's a lot you cannot hide. Maybe a child doesn't understand all the political movements that are going behind this, but they see so much. And how does that shape and form who they are? It is a hard punch. But again, this is aimed at middle school level. moved me as an adult. And it is a book, too, that provides a look at what the ghetto life was like. And so a lot of times you will read memoirs and things that will really focus on just being in the camps. But this is focusing on life in the ghetto, and which was very devastating and difficult to find food, difficult to keep your family together when it feels like hope is lost. And so, what was that experience like? Yellow Star. The last book I want to share with you is The Boy at the Top of the Mountain by John Boyne. Many of you are probably familiar with his other work, which is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was made into a movie. I know the book, when I had it in the school libraries I worked at, constantly was disappearing from the shelves. It just never got returned. And The Boy at the Top of the Mountain provides a lens into the question, how was Hitler able to influence people to believe what he believed? I mean, that's still one of the questions that people discuss, right? How is this man able to like I don't know, sorcerer trick? My sister and I were talking about this, and in one of her history classes, her psychology classes she had with Mr. Hafner. Those of y'all who had Mr. Hafner out of Santa Ana High School, I know you all love him, but he talked about the linguistic patterns of influential leaders. Okay, people still study the power that he seemed to hold and influence. Okay, so The Boy at the Top of the Mountain examines that. So what you have is a young orphan, only person he had in his family. His father died in World War I. His mother does pass away quickly in the beginning of the book. His name is Pearl, and he is best friends in the beginning of the book with a young Jewish boy who is deaf. Now, this boy, okay, Ansfeld, already has 2 strikes against him according to the Nazi regime, okay? Deaf, which means he's not able-bodied, and that's right, he's Jewish. Yet, this is his best friend, and he even knows some sign language in order for them to communicate. So you get that this is a young boy who is caring, who is kind, who is loving, who has these wonderful qualities and characteristics. He lives in Paris, a city of culture, a city of acceptance, of diversity. But his mother dies, and his aunt Beatrix is, all he knows of her is that she is the housekeeper of a very wealthy household. Well, guess whose household it is? Dun, dun, dun. Hitler, at his beautiful mountain estate. So he goes there to live. And she has to pull some strings because Hitler's not a big fan of kids. But he becomes a fan of this young man. But he makes him change his name to Peter because it's not that way. It's not so French. Forget the French. But he accepts him because his father was German and he had served, even though his mother was French. And what you start to see is a psychological transformation in this young man. At first, he's not sure of Adolf Hitler and of what's going on. He's not entirely aware of the transformation that's happening. But he becomes a wonderful little Nazi. He becomes ideal. He becomes a mini Hitler. And as you read this, you start to understand why someone might be influenced. I'm not saying you're going to start ending up, being excited and you want to join up. I'm saying that you can start to understand why someone might be influenced, at least on a personal level, if you had exposure to this. So you follow his journey all the way until the end of the war, the entire time he's there. Here's another lens. So far I've shown you lenses of World War II, of being Jewish in the ghetto, of being Jewish and as a child having to hide in the woods and survive, And then of not being Jewish, but being German and falling for Hitler's ideology. Lots of perspectives, and we haven't even left Europe, and we're not going to leave Europe. I want to show you that there's so many different ways that you can examine history through the eyes of fictional characters. And next time, we're going to talk about young adult historical fiction books in World War II. Um, and you'll see why they're more classified as young adult. Now, again, everybody has their own maturity level, and so it depends on where you're at when it comes to reading. But until then, remember your story is important, and at some point, you're going to become a part of history. So keep that story going, and until then, keep reading.